You're listening to Design Systems Beyond the Button, where we dive into everything related to design systems for everyone from newbies to seasoned practitioners. I'm Neff, Product Marketing Manager at zeroheight, and I'm excited to use this podcast to get my burning design systems questions answered. I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Chen, a design advocate who has seen and experienced so much around design systems.
And I'm really looking forward to sharing the tips, tricks, and experiences based on what I've done, but also from what I've seen from other design system teams. There's not much being said publicly because design systems can really be so personal to a company. So, this is a great way to shed insight. So, you can then take that insight and create your bestest design system ever.
Amazing. We figured for the very first episode, we would start with what feels like a simple question, but also feels quite complex. What is a design system? And I took the liberty to do some internet sleuthing to be able to figure out if the internet could define this for us. And what they say is that a design system is a complete set of reusable components guided by standards. And I got to be honest, that definition itself didn't really feel complete enough. Like, what does it mean to have a complete set of reusable components? What do you have to have in those components to actually make them reusable? And like, what the heck are those standards? So I suppose I was going to throw to you to do what the internet couldn't and help us define what a design system actually is.
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure. I feel like the internet always has the right answers. Um, so I think it's an interesting definition because it's like guided by standards. Like, are the standards part of the design system, or are they not? So I think when you think of a design system at a high level, there's some tangible aspects of the design, like the actual libraries that you might use for the design of the buttons and other various components that compose a website or an app. And then there's the coded aspect of it. So those actual like designed elements that you use in your design tool as the actual in real life coded versions of them that
Mhm.
appear in your products. And then there's the documentation that tells people, I guess, guides people on how to use and not use those pieces when building your app or site or product, what have you. I think that's it in a nutshell, right? Like, was that easy?
I feel like that was relatively easy. So what I got from that is you have to have the design part of it. What does this component actually look like? The code aspect of it, like how do we code it to get it into a product that real people can use? Then you've got your documentation that tells you what you should and shouldn't do with these components. And then theoretically, you also have this site that potentially wraps all of those things together. It makes it really easy for folks to be able to parse through all of those different things. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing is like you need to have like all three of those components and bundled in something nicely packaged. Um, yeah, and I think what we'll do is like add a little ad about zero height in here because that's what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose like it does make sense, right? Like zero height is that binder or that connecting piece that gets all of those things into one place in a pretty package, I suppose, for folks to be able to actually use it to be able to create products faster. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the thing is like, I talk to companies who are, working through their design system, setting it up and that type of stuff. And they, feel like, oh, well, we have Figma and we have
Mhm.
Storybook. Like, why do we really need Zero Height? I'm like, well, Zero Height's like your launch pad. Like that's where
Mhm.
everyone starts and then branches out from because I think you can look, you can crawl through Figma files in Figma. You can use their search. You might find the wrong thing that looks right, and that can get you into hot water. So I think that's the thing is like thinking of like having a launch pad for your system um, is really important.
Totally. And I think I am curious where a company ought to start, right? I think there is this adage that like a design system is never done and it's something that you are continuously building and maintaining. But is comprised of all of these different parts. Do you start with creating something in Figma? Do you start with reusable code components? Do you have a site that maybe at first doesn't have very much in it? Like how does one actually go about creating a design system and then throwing it out there on a launch pad like Zero Height?
Yeah, I think that's also a really good question. I think the trends have been changing, with especially with the ease and the way the tools are able to keep up and make our our workflows more efficient. So before it would be like, okay, we have to design something in a design tool and then engineering codes it, and that can still very much be a thing that happens. Um, and then it's like, well, once we get all our pieces together, then we'll start the documentation site, because that's going to be harder. And I think with all the tools that are available at our disposal, from like design to engineering, you can do that all at once now.
Hmm.
So you don't have to take a more linear path. And I definitely don't recommend people taking a linear path, because once you like, if you build the design components and then you code the engineering components and then wait to do your documentation, what's happening is that people are starting to build habits of not using documentation at all to do their job. And
Hmm.
then when you introduce documentation, they're like, well, I haven't had to use it now or before, so why would I need to use it now? And while you might understand the value of using it now, they have built this habit of like, I don't really buy it. Like, now you're just making me do extra work. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the challenge comes from. So if you start at the beginning of like, hey, we've made like a button, because I think everyone starts there. Whether you should start there or not, that's a different story. But you create the button in design, you code it, and then you write some guidance and you put all that information on your doc site. It doesn't have to be a complete doc site. It could just have that one component of your button and saying, this is when you use it, this is when you don't use it, this is how you use it. And so on and so forth. And that kind of just helps build the understanding that this is a designed system, right? So it's not just like little pieces, it's actually a comprehensive thing that we all should be using.
Totally. So, do you recommend that folks start with a relatively simple design system that then builds the habit of people going to the doc site and using it as part of their practice?
Yeah, for sure. And doesn't necessarily mean you're having to start from scratch. I think
Mm.
depending, some of your designers might have already created components in Figma or whatever design tool that is reusable for them, but they just haven't shared it. And then same with engineering, maybe some of the developers have created some reusable components, so it's just a more like a matter of like orchestrating that and kind of putting that all in one spot for everyone to use. So like I said, you might not be starting from scratch, so kind of see like where things are with your teams, and see like where you can easily align, because I think the big thing is like, it doesn't need to be this huge overhaul.
Mhm.
Think about like the most used components, the most universal components, and start there. See if there's already like a UI kit library that has some of these components. See if the code is available, and just putting that in a spot, adding some usage guidelines to start slowly building it. Is a good way to kind of get into that habit of building your design system. Doesn't have to happen overnight, and it's hard for it to happen overnight. So, so yeah, starting slowly is what I recommend.
Totally. I think often when I speak to some teams, they start with the assumption that they have 0% of a design system. And listening to you talk, it sounds like for most folks, that just isn't true. You might have 10% of it or 20% of it in the form of a UI kit or in the form of code that has been passed around, even if it's just on a Notion doc or has been documented in GitHub or any other place that that might be present. And almost the first task that you have as a design system practitioner is to figure out where all of these mini or almost design systems might live or components of a design system and figure out how to bridge them together. And it almost seems like once you're able to do that, you sort of have like your first win and your first piece of buy in from the organization at large, because at the very least, you've made it easier to find what has already existed and people are already getting value from. Does that seem right?
Yeah, 100%. Like that's a great way to think about things is that, it's really just kind of, rounding up things that already exist. So to add further value. So it's not this like, I don't know, albatross where you're trying to like, let's build this design system. We've got so many components. And if you look at IBM's Carbon and they've got so much and we've got zero, right? Like you have stuff. It's just a matter of like, tidying it and putting it in a package.
Yeah. And what about when I'm ready to go beyond a button? I think you're 100% right that lots of teams start with pretty simple components like a button. But what other things should be a part of a design system as it matures? What can I document to make it easier for my team to get products out there to real users?
Yeah, there's definitely some more tactical things. So a lot of people start with like foundations, or maybe they don't start with it, but they also include foundations. And
Mhm.
some of that, if you have like a brand established or a brand team, you might include like the color palette, the typography, that type of stuff that might already be defined in other styles you're using. So documenting some of that foundational language is really helpful. And beyond the button, literally. Um, you can start to document patterns. So there's different types of patterns. So a layout pattern of like how you might lay out components in a modal or a form, or like a workflow pattern of like how someone might be the screens that might see when they log in, what that pattern looks like. And then there's also content patterns. So I know Ivan had asked a question, how or where do you document the usage guidelines for content editors? So part of it you can have as part of your foundations, like your voice and tone, some specific words that you do or don't use for your product, as well as content patterns of like what are the voice and tone or the structure of error messages or for particular patterns in your product. So I think those are like kind of the other things that people can start to add, which I think is also really helpful, literally beyond the button, right? Like beyond those components.
So, talk to me a little bit about how that changes the workflow for design system consumers. So, what does it look like when people have only components like buttons documented versus having things like more complex patterns in pages?
Yeah, I think, the lift of consuming the design system isn't gonna be that much. That's like it's like a little bit like of a warm-up exercise. Like
Mm,
they probably all know how to use the buttons for the most part. So it's a matter of them like knowing what the correct library is to pull from to get those assets. So you're kind of getting them like, like trained and kind of getting them exercised in using the tools that you have. So like your design system tools or your design tool, like where the libraries are for the engineers, where do they find those coded components? And if they do have questions around like trickier uh, edge case scenarios or usages around some of the components, they can look it up on the design system documentation site. So it's really getting that like kind of mind shift set to using what's available. And then as you introduce more complicated components, they're going to want to double check what they're using, or if
mm.
you add components that they don't frequently use. So maybe like a date picker or something, they can go reference like, how am I supposed to use the date picker? Where can I find the date picker? That type of stuff. So then they'll get there eventually.
For sure. I like the articulation of trying to change behavior. And it seems like a lot of this is just like understanding how humans work and making it easy for them to want to use the design system. And I suppose, like, in that same vein, Neil has a question as well, where they're asking, is it necessary for all of the stakeholders to have their input to decide things like guidelines and usage and design? And I suppose I'll add to Neil's question. I wonder, does them having input or not having input affect their likelihood of wanting to consume that documentation?
Yeah. So I guess like, maybe to clarify, like understanding who exactly the stakeholders are, the stakeholders,
Mm,
the users, or the stakeholders like your higher up leadership. Um, so I think, from the day-to-day users, like definitely getting their input is really helpful because they have the context around things. Um, and they probably have more context around usage guidelines. But Neil is talking about leadership. So yeah, definitely in terms of leadership, that's a whole different ballgame. I think that's the thing is like some leaders feel that they need to be super, super invested in every decision in the design system. And to a certain extent, I kind of get that because they are held accountable to the consistency of their product, the look and the experience at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, like they should understand that they've hired experts. So designers who know their stuff, who can understand and define usage guidelines for components.
mm,
Um, I think, depending on your product or your products and the what you're working on, there should be someone that has some semblance of like an art direction skill set. So that might come in the form of like a director or someone in leadership who can um, set the vision for like the design and the aesthetic of your products and design system. Um, but for the day-to-day stuff, like, in component building and that type of stuff, it should rest on the design team themselves to make those decisions or in combination with engineers that work on it as well. And I think the biggest thing is like, and I did have this trouble with before running design systems where, um, the leader felt that they needed to be super, super involved because they were held accountable. So they wanted to like, and yeah, they are able to make all those decisions, but should they? Not really, because they have other leadership things to do, right? So it's more about like having them understand that they can trust the leadership, or they can trust the design system team um, to come up with some good decisions, good recommendations, and maybe if the design system team or the designers or engineers on the team can't make a decision, maybe the leadership can weigh in on some of that. But I think because leaders are so aware of how accountable they are, they mostly just want to be informed. So, a lot of times I would say, okay, we're not here to go over the finer details of usage guidelines. Like, we just want you to know this is what we set as the usage guidelines. And we want to know that, or we want you to know that we've changed this one thing here or whatever. In other things, like I've divided like around decision making, like if there is a component that's frequently visible or frequently used in a product, like a button, maybe
mhm,
they have a say in the art direction of the button or what have you, because that is something that is very visible for the product and something that the leaders will be held accountable to. But for like another obscure component, like maybe uh, like a file upload picker, like they don't need to weigh in on that. They can just be informed that this has been designed because it only shows up in like 2 spots in the product. So kind of understanding that, like where you want them to weigh in, but also making sure they feel comfortable with um, what level that we're asking for their involvement, and what level makes sense for them. And it's really a lot of like a lot of it's just I don't know, like managing up and work like
mm.
knowing how to work with people to be able to say, hey, we know you're super busy, so we want you weighing in on the most important decisions. And they'll get that. Like don't waste your time like weighing in on a component that's only used in one screen. Like we want your feedback and overall design feedback on the vision. You know, are we doing right by the vision that the teams established, that type of stuff. So um that's kind of my guidance from there. Um hope that was helpful.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I really like sort of thinking about what impact each of the different things that we're documenting will actually have, right? Like, I think by very nature of a design system, we know that anything that we put in there is going to be reused in some way, but obviously the magnitude in which it is reused is a lot different, depending on the particular component. I also think that there are some things in a design system that are more governing in nature, right? So if we think about things like our foundations or our overall design principles, it seems like that might be something that is worth getting buy in from leadership on, and then sort of saying, okay, based off of these foundations that we've set, that is going to govern how we go about creating all of these components and patterns. So if you've given your thoughts there, then that has already trickled down to all of these other things that we're going to do on a day to day, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think that's the thing is like design systems just, aren't those like coded components or library kits in your design tool. Like there's so much more to that. Like it's that whole governance that you mentioned, Neff, is, understanding how components get added to the design system. Who
Mm,
is responsible and who's held accountable for making those decisions? Who is, you know, just going to be informed? And why is that the case? And understanding like, how changes are communicated. How does someone go about submitting a component? What does that look like? There's a lot of like intangible things that people just like, that aren't part like of a visible design system, but are very integral to the health of a good design system. And then, having that defined and documenting that is super important because that way everyone can kind of go to your launch pad. Hopefully your launch pad zero height, but you can go to your launch pad and then go, okay, what's the process? I have this cool component, I want it added. And then they can kind of see like what the process is. And maybe they can submit it. Maybe it's not ready to be submitted. Maybe if they have questions, they know who to reach out to. So it leaves it so there's people aren't making stuff up, making assumptions, chasing after random people. It also helps a design system team so they're not fielding a ton of questions because as design system teams, especially if there isn't an established team, you're probably doing other project work. And as much as you want to be helpful in answering questions, you don't necessarily have the time, or it can be very interrupting to your zen flow of designing when someone's like, hey, I want to submit this button or this component for the design system. What do I do? Like if it's documented somewhere, they can go and answer that themselves, to hopefully make your life easier and their life easier too.
for sure. So far we've talked about a couple of core groups. You've got the main design system contributors, which might be folks who are entirely dedicated to design system work, or folks who are partially dedicated. We've got leadership that's going to sit above that design system team, and might have minimal input into the design system. And then we also have this group that we've talked about a little bit, but not a whole lot. And those are all of the people in the organization that are going to consume the design system and hopefully make it a pretty core part of their workflows. So, who are those people? And maybe we sort of separate them by the people who are going to get the most value and be in the design system day to day, and perhaps people that might be ancillary to that and might need to view it every once in a while, but we still ought to think about.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the secret, or maybe it's not the secret. It's just maybe something that's unknown is that the people that use your design system there's so many people and you might not know it because they're not coming to you with questions. They just happen to go to your launch pad, right? So, I think most obviously is the designers and engineers, who are coming in to figure out, what are the components I should be using to build the product with. Um, and, adjacent to that, there might be some content writers, UX writers, technical writers who might want to come in to understand, like if there's any content patterns they should be aware of, voice, tone, language. I think the thing is like, depending on how well versed you are with the design system and your level of experience building things within the product, you might not have to like reference the design system documentation site like all the time. You just reference it when you aren't sure or just want to double check or if there's something new, just so you're aware of things. So you're not, it's kind of like Wikipedia. You're like, oh, I don't know, is this person still alive? So you like look them up and and you find out if they're, this is the Halloween episode. So we're going a little morbid. So we see, oh, I didn't know that person was still alive. So stuff like that, you kind of just like reference check it. But I think beyond that, there are lots of other people. So like maybe your product manager who isn't, in the day-to-day weeds of designing things might have some questions around how things are being done or what options they have if they're thinking through other things, and other features, and just maybe trying to keep a pulse on what other products are
Mm,
doing. Um, I think also, the research team too, maybe you have researchers helping you with design system components and stuff, like vetting them, but they might want to see like, oh, if it's part of our process to test components in a more organic way as part of like a workflow, let me see what changes have been made, let me see if we've tested any of these components, and if not, let's see if we can fit them in to some upcoming usability tests. And I think beyond that, like also QA people might be testing a feature and say, oh, this button acted weird. I don't know if it's a bug or if this is by design, so they can reference that as well. Technical writers who do, if you have like enterprise products who are like writing those like hardy instruction documentation, they might want to see like how components should be used. So if they can get the right terminology correct, that type of thing. Um, and even beyond that, like, depending on how your team or organization is set up, you might have a separate brand or marketing team. They might want to check in to see, like, how is the brand being adopted within product so they can showcase that. Maybe there might be some tweaks that they need to make to the actual brand and stuff. Because I know previously when the brand was redesigning a color palette for this one company I was working with, the color green wasn't accessible. So we worked with them on tweaking the color green to make it accessible for our products. And so it was good so they can reference, okay, like what is that accessible green that we should use for product, that, should we make it part of our brand, so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of design system, a lot of, yeah, users to your design system. And they might pop out of the woodwork. And surprise you. As I remember, I was working with at one company where the marketing team and brand team was separate. They worked on the marketing websites and not the product websites, and they launched their design system. And we had all these other engineers who didn't work on marketing see this, and they started like pinging our design team, going, "Hey, what's up with this? What about this?
mm,
Or I'm trying to use this. I don't know how to, And it's just like I didn't even think that those engineers would like even start to like look at the design system for the marketing team. So it was an interesting lesson learned because I was like, oh, you never know who's going to look at your site. Um, and even like people, if it's your site's public, people might look at it and like, especially like interview candidates may
mm.
want to see like, hey, oh, do they have a design system? What does it look like? Oh, it's great. I kind of want to work there, right? Like, I think it's a good way to attract good talent or deter talent if your design system is not not great.
For sure. So, to me, it kind of sounds like most people in an organization would be able to find some value in the design system, right? Like, it might be that they come and get a question answered, and they do that once a year or twice a year, versus folks who are in it. But I would think, especially if I am in a large organization, the challenge becomes how do I make sure that all of these people are actually aware of the design system? So, how do you handle that? Like, how do you handle design system adoption? How do you handle communication? So, like that initial launch, and then also saying, hey, we've changed this component or we've updated this color or whatever it may be. Like, just like, how do you get the word out?
Yeah, I think that in itself is like its own thing that a lot of people don't think about necessarily until they've created a design system and they're like, nobody's using it. And oftentimes it's like, well, how have you been telling people? Oh, we haven't been telling people. Okay, like you got to get the word out. And I think the biggest thing is like a big lesson learned is not to create extra like places for people to have to like tune into.
Mm,
So I think a couple things. So I think like one of our, so for Zero Height and the content community team, like one of our like values and principles is go where the people are. So, we're not going to stand up something new if we know that people are, all at this one place. Um,
mhm.
I think the same thing, like to a certain extent, because I think, it is important, like having a Teams channel or Slack channel for design system updates, but letting people know that it exists. I think in terms of getting awareness overall for your design system, it's important to go where the people are. So think about any of your quarterly meetings as like an engineering org or a design org, a product org in general, like whatever like planning sessions you might have. Anytime you have like a opportunity to share, like, or even for designers, like design critiques, hey, we've got a design system update. Don't be shy about telling people about it. I think the thing is like some people are like, oh, like you're gonna wait to be asked by engineering to talk about your design system. No, just like say, hey, I want to have 10 minutes to talk about the design system with the engineering team the next time we do quarterly planning. I think most of the time, they're not going to say no. Like they want people to know, like to share this information. They're just not going to think about to ask
Mhm,
you to do that. So being more proactive on that front, and then sharing it in like any like if there's weekly emails that are sent out by the organization or
mhm,
whatever email comms there are. I would consider. I think the biggest thing is like um, just wherever you can go. Um, set up like the word and you can even say like and it doesn't mean that you have to say oh, every time there's a meeting, I have to tell them what the component update was. Like we changed the border from pink to blue. It's not that granular. I think that it's more about communicating. Hey, we have this channel for updates. We have this
mhm,
channel for questions. These are the people you can talk to. This is the site where you can go to get all your information. So they know kind of where to go for information. But I think it is also kind of comes to back to when I was like first manager, one of the advices like someone gave me was like, expect to repeat yourself a lot. And I was like, oh. And I like don't like repeating myself a lot. Like I just feel like if I told you once, it should be good enough. But sometimes people need to be told, two or three times, even five times. So I think that's the thing is like be consistent, just keep like talking about your design system, talk about the resources. You're going to repeat yourself a lot, but it's like well worth it because if people are kind of wrapping their head around things, changing
mhm.
their habits, like now they have to go look at a new Slack channel for stuff. But they'll get there and it's just going to take a little bit of time and repetition at first. So yeah, say it loud, say it proud.
Totally. And I think the more often you share the same message, you also start to create these mini evangelists that perhaps you know about, or maybe you don't even know, who are going off into their own teams or talking to colleagues that you might not be directly connected with and sort of saying like, hey, there's this brand new design system that we can use that's going to make us faster and includes lots of components and all of these things. So I think it can feel like such a rote process to try to get anybody to adopt anything new, but when you have some fidelity to that process, you go around and you realize, hey, this is working because people are going to like have side conversations about the work that we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Like if you see like, you might have your common engineers who are always asking questions in the Slack channel. If you see like a random person that you don't really know asking, you're like, "Whoa, like they got the memo." Like that's cool. For sure. And I think that's the thing is like you bring up a good point about like champions and advocates is that like you will start to get a sense of who is an ally. And then maybe you can say, "Hey, like thank you so much for sharing about the design system, like can we loop you in more with updates? Do you mind sharing them?"
Mhm,
And that kind of like offloads some of the onus from the design system team to kind of share it with other people because all I have to do is just like, oh yeah, like quarterly check-in or whatever, and they send out the information. They can ask questions, they can get really engaged, and people like participating in design system. I think every time I've formed a design system team like grassroots, like 50 people want to join, and I'm like, I would love to have you all, but like I cannot have you all. Because yeah, then we would just never get any decisions made. And everyone else has to do like we all have to do product work. But yeah, I think that's the thing is people want to be involved in something that is awesome and exciting. That is helpful, right? Like it's meaningful work.
mhm. For sure. And I I heard one designer describe it as something that is bigger, right? Like if you are a product designer and you design a page, it might be that that page is used one place in one product. But then if you say, okay, I want to be a designer on the design systems team, then almost overnight your work is replicated across multiple different products in some instances or multiple different pages. And that is like kind of cool, like to like go to bed and be like, man, I've made quite an impact, like my work is all over this product. That would make me feel good at least.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what's really exciting is that like your impact is very spread out. Like the breadth of your impact is huge versus like making one feature. And I think what's kind of cool is like as a product designer, like having to think about design systems, you're forced to kind of level up your skill like naturally
Mm,
because you're like, well, how is this going to work not just for my product, but how is it going to work across everyone's product? Or how is it going to scale for different devices? Like maybe you don't work on a mobile app, but like part of putting the button component in the design system is how does it work in mobile? So you're pushing yourself to think more strategically and systematically, which I think is what's really cool as well as like you're building that systems thinking muscle and skill set to know how to adopt and consider like what's really important, what's not important, which those skills translate really well. Like if you decide to work at another company that has complicated products, you have a good sense of, what can be done or what should be done, what levers to pull, what balance to make, what concessions to make, because you've got like you've got spidey senses, right? Like you've built up that library of like, okay, I need to think about these couple factors, and you're not just like focused on one screen, one app, you know?
totally, totally. I feel like we have had such a robust conversation about not only what a design system is, but also the process in which somebody would go through in order to create a design system that is adopted by folks organization wide. We kind of started with this small definition of a complete set of reusable standards are reusable components guided by standards. I would almost say that based on the conversation that we've had thus far, I would amend that definition to be a complete set of reusable components, foundations, and patterns guided by standards that are reinforced by systems changed and maybe something around design system adoption. I don't know. What do you think is like the real definition after talking about it for the last 35 minutes or whatever it's been?
Yeah, yeah. I think, I feel like that is like the essence of like what the definition is. And we'll have to like feed it to Google so they can change their response. Um and yeah, I think that's the thing is it's like it is all of those things. So I think with
Mhm,
design systems, it's more about, and which is why we started the series, is like thinking beyond the button, like what else is there that we don't know? And the idea is that you might not know everything, and you might only find out on when you cross that bridge, which is always going to be a fun surprise, which I think is a lot of what I run into when working with design system teams. But thinking that it is all those tactical aspects, but
mhm.
also a lot of those intangible aspects, um, all bundled to one, and that it is a system. It is a like a very broad system, which I think can also feel very intimidating too, right? Because you're like, oh, if I'm just starting a design system, how do I go from like just some little itty bitty components to like this broad system?
Mhm.
Um, which I think, you don't have to do overnight, obviously. Don't try to do overnight. Don't try to do it. It can take years. I mean, if you think about where material design started out 10 years ago, it's come so long. And that's because they've been able to build upon it year over year. But I also had like a bajillion people working on it. So realistically, teams don't have a bajillion people to work on it. And I think it's kind of setting some goals as to like what you want your design system to be in, the next quarter, the next year, the
Mhm.
next 2 to 5 years, and working toward that. And you'll eventually get there. Some of it might come easier than other aspects. And at some point, yeah, you might be scrambling at the beginning just to kind of get the process kind of sorted, and you eventually get into like a maintenance phase, which I think is just it's really nice. Like enjoy that maintenance phase, like take a breather, and then see like where else you can, you know, expand your design system to kind of encompass like all those aspects that we named and talked about today.
Totally. And I suppose I'll ask one more question before we wrap up our very first episode. Does it even matter if we all have slightly different definitions of a design system as long as we're all using it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in the general world speaking, we're all going to have different definitions of what a design system is, but everyone on your team or your organization or
Mm,
whoever's consuming it should have a very clear understanding of what design systems mean to you and your company. Because if there's a difference of understanding, people aren't going to understand all the little bits and pieces in the process. So as long as like your core teams that need to consume the design system all have that shared understanding, that's fine if it's different than what I think a design system is, or what, you know, IBM thinks a design system is, or Salesforce, or Material, or any of those other lovely sites,
mhm.
or Dan Mall, because I have to name drop Dan Mall in every episode that I do, or what Dan Mall thinks. So, yeah, I think that's the thing is like everyone on your in your immediate purview should have the same understanding.
Absolutely. And hopefully, this episode helps folks come to a shared understanding of how they want to define design systems in their organization. Thank you so much for joining episode 1 of Design Systems Beyond the Button. I am Neff. I was joined by Michelle, a design advocate at Zeroheight. Next month, we are answering the question, who uses a design system? Really, who uses it? So join us then.
Thanks, everyone.